Our next speaker from UC Merced is Tanya Golash Boza. Tanya has 5 books to her name, maybe a 6th one on the way, or maybe even just arrived. She's a very prolific researcher and writer. Her work on immigrant studies is really remarkable, and she's here to speak with us about this.
That might have looked like a party trick, but I was just getting some water. Good afternoon. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to follow up these amazing speakers. I'm going to move the conversation. We're not going to go too far from where we've been, because mass deportation has a tremendous amount of parallels with mass incarceration. But thanks to all of you for coming out to listen, and thank you very much to the organizers for organizing this really important event focused on social justice in the Central Valley. What I want to do today is I want to tell you a story about mass deportation and global capitalism. And I'm going to tell you that story drawing from a lot of stories that I've collected. So between May of 2009 and August of 2010, I interviewed 147 people who had been deported from the United States. And listening to their stories, I was able to get insight into what's going on in the United States today in terms of mass deportation. And also, as I listened to their stories, it occurred to me that it's very much connected with larger movements of global capitalism. So that's the story that I want to share with you today. But I'm going to start with one story. And this is a story from Guatemala City. So in 2009, I had the opportunity to witness the arrival of thousands of people arriving into the Fuerza Aérea Guatemalteca, which is the Guatemalan Air Force Base. So each day in Guatemala City, I would say each week, 4 to 6 plane loads of people arrive after having been deported from the United States. So one day I was at the Guatemalan Air Force Base watching the deportees get off the plane as part of my field work. And I saw a young man deplane, and I thought to myself, you know, he looks like he probably lived in the United States for many years. He looks like he probably grew up in the United States. So I went up to him and I introduced myself, told him I was a researcher. At that time, I was working at the University of Kansas, and that I wanted to talk to him about his life story and if he'd be willing to meet with me. He said, sure, I'll meet with you in about a month. I said, I want to meet with you in about a month time to see how things are going. He said, sure. I'm not sure if I'll still be here, but here's my aunt's phone number, and you can call me and see if I'm able to come. So I met up with him in Guatemala City a month later, and he told me his story. And I call him Eric, because I use pseudonyms in all of the research. So Eric grew up in Guatemala City with his mother, who was a single mother. He doesn't know what happened to his father. But when Eric was 8 years old, his mother decided to travel to Los Angeles. She was working in Guatemala City, but as a single mom, she wasn't really making enough money to afford all of the things that Eric needed to go to school. So she decided to try her luck in Los Angeles. And she wasn't able to take Eric with her, so she went alone. And she worked there. When she got to Los Angeles, she got a job in a garment factory. And after working there for 3 years, she saved up enough money to bring Eric. So she sent money home to her sister, who then managed to get Eric a tourist visa to come to the United States, and he came to the United States and moved in with his mother. When he got here to the United States, he enrolled in middle school. He was 11 years old. And things were going pretty well for him. His mother was working at the garment factory, and he had a couple of other family members in Los Angeles. But in his last year of high school, his mother injured her back at work. So she was no longer able to continue working, and her job didn't have any benefits or job security. So basically, when she injured herself and couldn't keep working, she had no options for making a living. So Eric decided that he would drop out of school and get a job in order to support the family. So Eric got a job, but he lives in Los Angeles, and I don't know how much you know about Los Angeles, but it's really hard to get around if you don't have a car. So Eric got a car in order to drive himself back and forth to work. But Eric was 17 years old, so he also used the car on the weekends to hang out with his friends. So one Saturday afternoon, a friend of Eric's asked him if he could give him a ride to the other side of town. Eric said sure, and he took him to the other side of town. And when he dropped his friend off, just after dropping his friend off, a police officer pulled him over, and the police officer believed that Eric's friend had gone on to commit a car theft and that Eric was an accomplice in the car theft. So based on that reasonable suspicion, the officer took Eric to the Los Angeles County Jail, and they ran his fingerprints through a database because Los Angeles County Jail participated in that time in a program known as Secure Communities. They ran his fingerprints through a database and found that Eric's visa had expired because they shared information with the Department of Homeland Security. And when it became apparent that Eric's fingerprints, that his visa was expired and he was not authorized at that time to be in the United States, they called Department of Homeland Security, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office, and they came and picked Eric up and took him to a Corrections Corporation of America private detention facility. Now, meanwhile, the police officers realized that it wasn't Eric, but another young Latino guy that they were looking for. But by that time, it didn't matter because he was basically already in the system. He was already, once they figured out that he was in the United States illegally, it didn't matter that he hadn't committed a crime. So he was arrested, he was taken to a detention center, and he was deported to Guatemala City. So I tell you Eric's story because I think his story gives us insight into larger structural processes. So, and I call this the neoliberal cycle. So if we look at the first thing, let's focus on global inequality. Does this have a thing? Anyway, global inequality and outsourcing. Okay, so why did Eric's mother leave Guatemala in the first place? Well, she left Guatemala City because when she was working in Guatemala City, she was working in a garment factory that produced clothing for export to the United States. She had a job, but she wasn't making enough money to get by. But because of her job in an international factory and because of the long history of immigration between Guatemala and the United States, she knew a lot of people in Los Angeles. So she decided to take advantage of that opportunity to go to Los Angeles. When she gets to LA, she's an undocumented worker. Like most undocumented workers, she found low-wage work in the semi-formal labor sector. Right? So she got a job in a garment factory. The next part of another prominent part of neoliberalism is cutbacks in social services. So when she was injured on the job, there was no safety net to catch her. Basically, she got injured on the job, she's incapable of working, and therefore she has no value to the company, and she loses her job, and she loses her only source of income. Now, California has cut back tremendously on social services for everybody over the past 20 years, but in particular for undocumented immigrants. At the same time that we've made tremendous cutbacks in social services, we've spent a lot of money on enhancing the coercive arm of the state, or we might call in everyday conversation, the police, the criminal justice system. And that's what led to Eric getting arrested, because really Eric wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, but the heavy presence of police in his neighborhood meant that he was more susceptible to getting arrested, even though he hadn't committed a crime. And another important part of neoliberal changes to the economy is privatization. So when Eric was first arrested, he was taken to the Los Angeles County Jail, which is a county facility. But he was transferred to the Corrections Corporation of America, which is a privately owned detention facility. So a lot of people talk about the privatization of prisons and the corporate profits coming out of prisons, and that's certainly a factor. But private prisons make up a small percentage of criminal law enforcement facilities, but they actually make up 30% of all immigration detention facilities. So today, there are about 35,000 immigrants behind bars on immigration violations, and about 30% of those are in private facilities. And the largest stakeholder is Corrections Corporation of America, and the second largest is Geo Group, also known as Wackenhut. So there's a corporate interest in immigration detention. And so I call this a cycle instead of just a pathway, because when Eric was deported to Guatemala City, he went to his aunt's house to live, back where he had lived before. But in addition to that, he was able to find employment in Guatemala City. Eric got a job in a call center. So having lived in the United States for most of his childhood, he's perfectly bilingual between Spanish and English. He knows all about the sports teams in the United States. He's bilingual and bicultural. He's an ideal employee for a call center. So basically, if you call Sears, for example, because you ordered a refrigerator and it's running late, Eric would answer the phone. And he would be able to tell you, oh, sorry, your refrigerator is running late, it'll come at 3 o'clock. So he's able to, even though he's no longer in the United States, he's able to provide his labor to transnational corporations in a very similar way to his mother, right, who was working in a garment factory in Guatemala before she left. And then it's also low-wage work in Guatemala. He makes about $400 a month. He doesn't have any social services. There's also a concomitant enhancement of the coercive arm of the state. In Guatemala, the police officers often harass young men perceived to be deportees because of the presumed criminality. And then there's also privatization. So what I'm basically getting the point at is just by listening to his story, we can get insight into larger structural processes that are shaping this moment. So let's look at this moment and what it looks like. So Nigel showed you a graph of mass incarceration, and you'll notice that the shape of this graph is not too different. We basically see a general pattern. So these are deportations since 1927 from the United States. So what you'll see is that between 1927 and 1996, there were never more than 40,000 deportations a year. They fluctuated at different points for different reasons, but beginning in 1996, we see a tremendous upswing in the number of deportations. So what happened in 1996? Well, in 1996, President Bill Clinton was in office, and he signed 2 bills into law. The first one was the Illegal Immigration and Immigrant Responsibility Act, and the second one was the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. What these 2 laws did is they expanded the grounds on which you could be deported. So they transformed a lot of people who were not deportable into deportable people. And then they narrowed the grounds on which you could appeal. So prior to 1996, there were a lot of people that maybe they faced deportation, but if they actually got to see a judge, they could have their deportation orders reversed. So the 1996 laws removed those provisions. They also took a lot of due process out of immigration proceedings, but basically they just made a lot more people deportable and made it really difficult to move back from that. But we see it continues to rise, and it's interesting because the laws governing deportation have not really changed since 1996. There's been a couple of adjustments, but the laws are pretty much the same. So why do we see a continued rise, and we see a particularly sharp rise after 2003? So what happened is, you all know the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Subsequent to those, President George W. Bush, created the Department of Homeland Security, which was the largest federal government transformation perhaps ever. The budget of the Department of Homeland Security is $60 billion a year. Does anybody know what the budget is for the Department of Education, which governs every single K-12 institution in the country? Anyone want to take a guess? Well, no, I mean, the Department of Education is responsible for the elementary school that you went to, the middle school that you went to. Like, they're in charge of K-12 education in the whole country. So it's not $5 billion, it's a lot of money. What do you think it is?
600 million.
Okay, it's billions. We're talking billions. Billions, 600 billion, right? 6 billion, right? Okay, so the Department of Homeland Security's budget is $60 billion a year. The Department of Education is 79 billion. So it's more, but as you can see, it's basically, it's in the same ballpark, and the Department of Justice is 29 billion. Okay, so the Department of Homeland Security's major mission is to fight terrorism. But they use half of that $60 billion or $30 billion a year to fight immigration. So the federal government spends more money on immigration law enforcement than all other federal law enforcement agencies combined, right? So we spend more money on immigration law enforcement than the federal government spends catching criminals. And of course, this doesn't include the state law enforcement apparatus. But the point is, the reason why we've seen so much increase in deportations since 1996 is that the state has been investing a lot of money in immigration law enforcement, and immigration law enforcement is expensive. So it's been a tremendous budget priority for Congress and for the president. But deportations have not affected all groups equally. So beginning in 1996, as I explained, there was an increase in deportations, and the number of females deported from the United States increased in 1996. But what you see is that subsequent to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the number of women deported from the United States has remained flat, and the number of men has increased. So with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, there's been a gender difference in the way and the number of people that are deported. It's also not evenly spread out by national origin. Almost all of the increase in people deported from the United States has been directed at Mexicans and Central Americans, almost all. The little blue line that you may or may not be able to see is South Americans, a little bit of South Americans, but basically almost exclusively Latin Americans. So the green line on top is Mexicans. So there's been a steady increase in the removal of Mexicans from the United States. And there was a small increase in Central Americans, but with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, we see an increase in the Central Americans deported from the United States. So what this means, okay, 98% of people deported from the United States are sent to Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, I know you all probably watch a lot of television, but not all immigrants are from Latin America, and they're not all from Mexico. There's immigrants, we have immigrants in the United States from every single country in the world. About 60% of people living in the United States who are not citizens of the United States are from Latin America, but the other 40% are from the rest of the world, and those people are at a very low risk of deportation. 88% of deportees are men. Now, about 50% of people who are not citizens of the United States are women. So what we're seeing is that there's a gendered and race disparity in how immigration law is being enforced. Right? Because if we look at the population of undocumented immigrants in the United States, any one of those people is theoretically equally suspect or subject to deportation. But the likelihood that a woman, undocumented immigrant from Ireland, would be deported is practically zero. In contrast, the likelihood that an undocumented Honduran man would be deported is close to 15%. Right? So there's a tremendous disparity based on race, based on national origin, and based on gender. And if we think about the Caribbean, Jamaican and Dominican legal permanent residents face about an 8% chance of being deported. And if you're a legal permanent resident from Britain, your likelihood of being deported is close to zero. Okay, so why? Is it because these people are committing more crimes? Is that what's going on? And the answer to that is not exactly. So what I want to give you a picture here of is how and why people are getting deported. So in order to be deported from the United States, you can either be deported just on immigration grounds, So any undocumented immigrant can be deported just for being undocumented. But if you're convicted of a crime, then you can be deported on criminal grounds. So half of the people deported from the United States in 2012 were deported on non-criminal grounds. So they're not in this map at all. They're not in this figure at all. Right? So half of the people were deported, did not have any criminal convictions. The other half of people deported did have criminal convictions. But you wonder why is immigration in there? Okay, a quarter of people deported in 2012 were deported after having been convicted of an immigration crime. So what that means is that if you cross the border without permission, that can be considered a civil violation, or it can be considered a criminal violation. It's entirely a matter of prosecutorial discretion, right? So those 47,000 people deported for immigration crimes, almost all of them were deported for crossing the border, but it was prosecuted as a crime. The next highest category is traffic. Now, I'm sure many of you may or may not know people who are in prison, but there's very few people in prison for traffic crimes. Again, it's a matter of prosecutorial discretion, right? If you get pulled over for a DUI, you may or, whatever happens after that, you may or may not get a criminal prosecution. But a lot of people have been deported after being criminally prosecuted for traffic convictions. The next one is drugs. The single largest category in that box right there is marijuana possession, which has just been completely legalized in several states. So basically, yes, a lot of people are deported after committing crimes or being convicted of crimes, but a lot of those are crimes that are, I would say, they were convicted of crimes largely a matter of prosecutorial discretion, not really because they've committed heinous acts. At the same time that we've seen a rise in immigration law enforcement, we've seen a rise in immigration law enforcement inside the United States. So last year, 100,000 people were deported who have children who are US citizens. And this is a tremendous increase from the past. Between 1997 and 2006, we deported a total of 100,000 people with US citizen children. And prior to 1997, we barely ever deported someone who has US citizen children. But today, it's become common practice. So there's been a lot of attention about deportation in the recent years. But today I want to ask, why is mass deportation happening now? Why are nearly all deportees Latin American and Caribbean men? And how is deportation related to larger movements of labor and capital? Yeah, so why is mass deportation happening, and why is it happening now? So in order to explain why mass deportation is happening, I'm going to go back to the beginning and think about that neoliberal cycle that I showed you at the beginning. So we really need to think about movements of labor and capital in order to understand mass deportation. So I'm going to tell you another story, and this is a story about Guatemala. But the story I'm going to tell you about Guatemala could easily be a story about El Salvador or Honduras or Jamaica or the Dominican Republic or Chile or Cuba or Haiti, right? So basically, it's a story of US intervention in Latin America. So in 1954, the president of Guatemala was ousted from his office with the aid of US-funded troops. And these are pictures of, and that led to a civil war in Guatemala that lasted from 1954 to the peace accords were signed in 1996. And during that whole period, the United States was sending money and arms to Guatemala so that the Civil War would end up on the side that we wanted to win the Civil War. And towards the end of the Civil War, the United States began to send not only arms and money to fund the war, but also we began to send corporations to the United States. We began to sign trade agreements with Guatemala, and we began to promote foreign direct investment and the rise of maquiladoras in Guatemala. So remember how I told you Eric's mother worked in a garment factory in Guatemala City before leaving? Well, the United States companies built a lot of factories in Guatemala City. And what that does is it creates ties. So we already had ties because of the military involvement, but now we have even closer ties because of the capital investment in Guatemala. So the maquilas in Guatemala, they create jobs, but people don't earn enough to raise a family, And they also, they tend to employ young women, right, who just get out of high school or maybe who haven't finished high school. So they employ women when they're about 16 or 17, but by the time they're 25, they're often fired, or if they get pregnant, they're often fired. So it creates jobs, but for a limited time. And then when people lose their job at the maquila, they've been working for 5 or 6 or 7 years, they're moved to the Guatemala City, so they're living there. They don't have a lot of options, and a lot of times those people end up going to the United States, people who are already sort of in this circuit of global capital. Now, when they get to the United States, they often end up working in service sector jobs, which have been opened up by outsourcing. So think about this. When the Gap used to have a factory in San Francisco. When they moved their production to Guatemala City, all of the production jobs go away, but the office is still there, right? Many of you may or not have seen, but the Gap office is still in San Francisco, and the people that work in that office are high-paid executives. Right? So those high-paid executives, that creates a different kind of job than the factory job. Right? So now the people that work in the high-paid jobs in San Francisco, they need, they're lawyers, they're accountants, they're global financial advisors, they're management consultants, right? What do they need? They need restaurants, they need dog walkers, they need nannies, they need house cleaners. Right, so they need gardeners, especially in Los Angeles and to some extent in San Francisco. So basically, outsourcing took away manufacturing jobs from the United States, but it created all these service sector jobs, which immigrants came to fill. Right, but as you can see, there's a relationship between these flows of capital, and labor across border. So what happened was in the United States, a lot of companies did this. A lot of companies began to send their labor, their production abroad. And the reason why they did this is because they were facing increased competition. And the United States was facing a severe economic crisis in the late 1970s. And this economic crisis was solved to a large extent by exporting labor, by exporting jobs, right? So the Gap has been able to survive. Ford Auto Company, General Motors Corporation, all these companies were able to survive because they sent their jobs to other countries, right? So we solved the tremendous economic crisis of the 1970s through outsourcing. But during this era of globalization, when we're moving all these jobs abroad, we're sending financial advisors around the world, we're developing new trade agreements, the movement of capital was facilitated, but there weren't any laws passed that really facilitated the movement of labor. Right? So we're creating all these global connections in the 1980s, but we're not creating any new pathways, or very few new pathways for people to come to the United States to work, which was a natural outgrowth of the expansion of global capital. So many of you also may know, in 2007, capitalism has entered a new crisis, and the current crisis can't be solved through outsourcing, primarily because we're kind of outsourced out. Right? We've already outsourced practically everything. If we were to do an inventory of the clothing that you all are wearing, 80 to 90% of it is going to be made in China, in Honduras, in Guatemala, basically in other countries. So we've kind of saturated that market, so we don't have that option anymore. So it's a crisis with no clear solution. So there's an economic slowdown in the United States, there's high unemployment, and then there's a reduced need for immigrant labor in particular. So these extra jobs, these service sector jobs, they're often the first to go. And one of the major sectors that has suffered during the current economic crisis is the construction sector, where a lot of Latino men are employed. So at the same time that we've seen a rise in the deportation of men since 2003, we've also seen an escalation in male unemployment. So there's a correlation between the rise in unemployment and the rise in male unemployment and the rise in male removals. These numbers are just for men here. We've learned a lot about mass incarceration today, but a lot of people, and one of the questions people asked earlier is why? Why did the United States begin to incarcerate a lot of people in the 1980s? Now, a lot of people argue that the reason that we began to incarcerate a lot of people in the 1980s was that the United States was in a crisis, there was high unemployment, there was urban unrest. And mass incarceration arose as a solution to mass unemployment, right? Oftentimes when the state confronts a crisis, the state responds with the coercive arm in order to prevent or dispel unrest. So during times of crisis, David Harvey argues the coercive arm of the state is augmented. So we see a parallel between the rise of the coercive arm of the state during the economic crisis of the 1980s that led to mass incarceration. And today, the economic crisis of 2007 has led to the rise of mass deportation. So another function of the coercive arm of the state, but also, or equally, in the context of an economic crisis. And the final piece of the puzzle here is that deportees are also serving global capital insofar as they're working in call centers, right? So Eric works in a call center, like I told you at the beginning, but he's just one of many. So since 1997, 5 million people have been deported from the United States. 5 million people. It's a lot of people. And not all of them are working in call centers because they're not all qualified to work in call centers, but of that population, there's a substantial number that's bilingual, that's bicultural, and that's perfectly fluent with computers, that's able to work in call centers. So since, or over the past 10 years, the call center, the English language call center sector has doubled in Mexico, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, and in the Dominican Republic. So global capitalists have been able to take advantage of the current moment of crisis in the United States by sending their production, not their manufacturing production abroad, but now their call center production. So it's been a new way to respond to the needs of the current economic crisis. So basically at the beginning, I showed you sort of Eric's story, but now I want to just come back to that. So when we look at Eric's story, we have economic hardship, which leads to migration, family separation, that leads to low-wage work in the informal economy, which leads to a police encounter, which leads to incarceration, which leads to deportation, which leads to disposed labor. So we're seeing this cycle manifest itself through mass deportation. And the other argument that I've made is that the same processes of neoliberal capitalist development have led to mass incarceration as mass deportation. So when we look at the 1970s to today, we see a crisis in the late 1970s, we see another crisis in 2007, and we see the response, we see the same response, global outsourcing of production and the rise of the coercive arm of the state through mass deportation and through mass incarceration. So why should we care? Why should we care about mass deportation? Why should we care about the United States getting rid of people, right, who are perhaps expendable? Well, I argue we should care for a lot of reasons. One is, the United States is spending a tremendous amount of money on mass deportation. The other is that mass deportation certainly affects undocumented immigrants, but most undocumented immigrants live in family units with US citizens. So now we have a situation today where there are 5,000 children in foster care because their parents have been deported and they're US citizens and they, for whatever reason, were unable to return to the home country with their parents. So now we have whole communities where people are being deported and the children are growing up knowing, just as many African American children grow up knowing that the state incarcerates their fathers, their brothers, their uncles, many Latino children are growing up today knowing that the state is deporting their fathers, their cousins, and their brothers. And this is something that should concern all of us. So anyway, brief plug for my book that's coming out tomorrow, which explains this hopefully more clearly and in more detail. Thank you. Do I have time for questions? Yeah? Nigel?
So do you interview the agencies, people or the agencies that do the deporting? In other words, I studied human rights in university, and many of my best friends are who I studied human rights with, and we were all about the cause of changing the world. Now work for the very organizations that deport or that do this, and it's because, right, they need jobs, they have families. So just as that prison industrial complex has created jobs and is part of our economic necessity, right, isn't it true the same for, I mean, you talk about the budget, but have you talked to those who are on that side that are profiting? And I mean, again, these are good friends. Like, we don't talk much now, but they are part of this, and it's something that they benefit from.
Yeah, so I have not interviewed either Border Patrol agents or Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents, and I've actually never seen a study of interviews with Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents, although there are a couple of studies of Border Patrol agents. And I was sort of thinking, because I think maybe it might be possible to interview retired ICE agents, but it's really hard to interview current ICE agents. But the studies I've seen of people that have interviewed Border Patrol agents, I mean, it's a conundrum. If you live in the Imperial Valley, you have a college education, you're bilingual, just like the prison jobs are some of the best paying, not the best jobs, some of the best paying jobs in the Central Valley. In the Rio Grande Valley, Border Patrol agents are some of the best paying jobs, and they require a certain set of qualifications. But the interviews show that when people talk to Mexican-American Border Patrol agents, there is a lot of conflict, but at the same time, a divide grows, right? People learn this discourse of they don't belong here, they broke the law, they're not supposed to be here, and they don't tend to think about the global movements of capital, right, that produce this migration flow in the first place. Yeah?
I'm wondering with regard to the children, the citizen children, having watched my own children have to write those letters to the court on behalf of their father. What's the possibility for doing in that area of research, being that you're dealing with children? Do you know any research like that?
Yeah, I mean, so it is, there are a couple of research projects that look at deporting the people whose family members have been deported. It's a relatively hard to find group because I mean, there's no, where are you going to just find people? So there have been a couple studies. There was a study done at UC Davis, I think, and a colleague and I actually have an ongoing study where we've been interviewing the family members of people in the Central Valley who've experienced deportation. So maybe in a year or so I'll be able to give that talk. But it has been pretty slow going because it's been hard to find people who've experienced that. Any other questions? In the back?
You said, why should we care? I believe that also it dehumanizes people. It takes the right of people being able to be fathers, uncles, brothers, freely. So, and not only that, these people are looked at as money now. So it's all about generating money. So I mean, as you can see, the whole system is very demonized, where it's just like any regular corporation, where they try to maximize their profit and minimize their cost of productivity. And of course, immigrants will do that because there's all kinds of laws and regulations that will criminalize these individuals, and therefore anybody can take advantage of that.
Right, I definitely think there's an empathy gap, which Kim is going to talk about in one of the next presentations, right? So if you think about, I mean, one question I ask myself is, would we have mass incarceration and would we have mass deportation if the primary victims were white people, right? It is something that I don't have, obviously I don't have a crystal ball, I can't create an alternate universe to test that hypothesis, but it's something to think about. And I think when we think about dehumanization, we also have to think about race, right? And the particular ways that Latino men and black men are dehumanized, and the particular ways that Latina men and black women are dehumanized. And think about the extent to which those discourses of dehumanization can serve to justify these systems of mass repression. Yeah?
Interviews that you've done have been people from a different race, like not just Latin America, but like Asians or Europeans. Have you ever encountered somebody?
Right, so when I did my research with people who had been deported, I only went to Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and Brazil. So in those countries, I did interview people of different races, but within the, they're within those national origin groups. Now there's an excellent documentary called Sentence Home about the deportation of Cambodians. The numbers are a lot smaller. About 300 to 400 Cambodians are deported every year compared to 45,000 Guatemalans. But nevertheless, the situation is extremely dire. With the Cambodians, but the story is very similar. Right? Why did the Cambodians come to the United States in the first place? Well, it's because the United States invaded that part of the world, right? And then they came over here because they had sided with the U.S., and then they were in danger because they tried to help us when we were over there. Then they came here, they moved to the United States, lived in housing projects. A lot of them lived in housing projects, and then their children, who were born maybe in a refugee camp in Thailand, but grew up here, got involved in gangs, got into trouble when they were teenagers, got a charge, right, and then were deported to Cambodia, where a lot of them hadn't even been in the first place. So no, I haven't, but my understanding is that the process is relatively similar, even though it's less likely to happen with Asians and Europeans. Yeah?
Are all the laws consistent in different cities and countries or states in terms of the relationship between the agencies, the ICE, the immigration, I don't know, Homeland Security? There's so many now that it's changed some of their relationships.
Right. So immigration law is federal law. So if you encounter an ICE agent or a Border Patrol agent, it doesn't matter what state you're in. If you encounter an immigration agent and you're undocumented, you're going to face deportation. Now, the question is whether when you encounter a police officer. So this is important because in the United States, we have 10,000 Border Patrol agents. We have 5,000 ICE officers for the whole country. So they can't deport 400,000 people. Most of it's happening through the police, right? So police officers are the first point of encounter for almost everyone who's deported from the United States, who lives in the United States. And those laws do vary, because obviously, right, and not just laws vary, but discretion, right? So if you're driving down the street and you don't have a driver's license because you're undocumented, the police officer could just let you go. Or he could arrest you and take you downtown if he wants to, and if that town cooperates with ICE, you're deported. But it could be another officer could just be like, oh man, I'm not gonna take you, you probably have kids, and just leave you. So yeah, so there's a tremendous amount of variation across states, but also at the individual level. Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much.